Gridate, popolo, sono tutt'uno! E questo popolo italiano è pronto a indossare lo zaino!
For 20 years, Mussolini ruled Italy. For 20 years, he occupied the center of the European stage. He invented a political system, fascism. He was a great actor, and the balcony was his theater. From the balcony, he dominated crowds and intoxicated them. From the balcony, he drew his inspiration. He once said, "I'm a kind of mad poet." Rather, he was a mad showman, a producer of spectacles, who was often taken in by his own acts. Fascism was show, drama, a series of stage sets. The scenery looked impressive, but as in the theater, there was nothing behind it. Appearance was all. Fascism meant uniforms, the fascist salute. Mussolini's own wardrobe would have dressed a whole costume play all by itself. He devised the effects and benefited from them. In his speeches, the way in which he delivered the words was more important than the words themselves. Mussolini called fascism part of the irrationalism of our age. He always appealed deliberately to passion, to emotion, to the senseless craving for wild action. It was in Milan before the First World War that Mussolini used the socialist platform as an outlet for his love of violence. Mussolini hated the rich, hated the aristocracy, hated respectability. He himself was a genuine son of the people. His father was a blacksmith. Mussolini struggled up to become an elementary school teacher. In Milan, he preached violence and left others to practice it. His preaching made him the editor of a socialist newspaper. Mussolini was a first-rate journalist in a sensational way, good at inventing headlines. He'd no interest in the news underneath. He soon abandoned his socialism and kept the violence. The result was fascism. Violence for its own sake. Violence as a political method. The love of violence culminated in the March on Rome, which was to carry Mussolini to supreme power. He claimed to be saving Italy from Bolshevism, or alternatively from anarchy. And there was nothing in this. The fascists themselves caused the anarchy from which they saved Italy. It was a simple exercise in blackmail, and a successful one. Anarchy and violence would go on unless fascism were given power. Mussolini did not march on Rome or anywhere else. He waited in the wings in Milan to see what would happen. He waited for the nerves of others to crack. He always expected others to do his work for him. On this occasion, the opponents of fascism worked almost as hard for Mussolini as the fascists did. This was the reality behind the seizure of power. There was no seizure of power. There were fascist demonstrations, there was violence, there were cheers for Mussolini. He himself usually kept out of the way for fear of being arrested. The fascist violence grew. Constitutional politicians and respectable generals began to say that the only way of keeping Mussolini quiet was to make him prime minister. They pressed this advice on King Victor Emmanuel III. In Rome, the king hesitated, trembled at the prospect of worse disorder. He was urged to use the army against the fascists. He refused. Instead, he decided to act in a constitutional way and summon Mussolini to Rome to appoint him prime minister. Mussolini arrived in Rome in a sleeping car. He'd entered it in Milan wearing a black shirt, and on the way, he changed into a frock coat. Whether the train ran to time history does not record. At any rate, he emerged wearing a top hat. He presented himself before Victor Emmanuel as though he were a respectable statesman of the old style. Once in power, was Mussolini still the man of violence, the repudiator, the destroyer? Or had he now become a moderate, conservative politician who wanted to bring Italy back to a quiet life? The answer was both and neither. Mussolini was a pretense, a fraud as a creative statesman, but he was as much a fraud as the man of violence and destruction. Mussolini was not merely appointed prime minister by the king in the constitutional way. He received, extraordinarily enough, support from the majority in the chamber during the early years of his power. There were only 50 fascist deputies, yet Mussolini held his own in the chamber without difficulty. Here again, he was a mixture of conservative and revolutionary. He changed Parliament into a sort of show with himself playing the chief role. He never gave in it to solid speeches of information and policy. The technique of the balcony was brought indoors. It was the same with all his actions as prime minister. He liked the glamour of his public appearances. The blacksmith's son was now greeted with awe. He even managed to provide himself with a cabinet of conventional or conventional-seeming politicians. He must surely have grinned contemptuously at them behind his hand. Others did the work, the negotiations with foreign statesmen, for instance. Mussolini only appeared when treaties had to be signed and the cameras began to run. He kept ahead of his work by doing none. What did fascism accomplish in these early years? The trains ran to time. Italy went back to the gold standard. Even this prosaic operation was carried through in a dramatic way. Italians were roused to sacrifice their savings in a ceremonial burning of bonds. The one thing Mussolini worked at was the strengthening of his own power. The old guard were pushed out of responsible posts, sent off into provincial obscurity. Unknown dependents of Mussolini took their place. The romantic poet Duce had offered a rival version of melodramatic politics. Mussolini learned many tricks from him, then threw him aside. Mussolini concentrated on winning Italy, projecting himself as the new leader, the champion of the masses. There was only one man in Italy, Mussolini. He projected himself as a wonder of physical achievement. Our King Henry VIII once said to the Venetian ambassador, "Feel that, the biggest thigh in England." Italians were left in no doubt that Mussolini was the strongest man in Italy. He was obsessed with physical display. There was not a sport at which he did not excel. In fact, this strong man worried constantly over his digestion. There was not a woman who did not, allegedly, succumb to him. He had innumerable mistresses, though he was a devoted family man as well. If he saw farmers working in the field, Mussolini had to strip off his shirt and join them, the finest farm laborer in Italy. Of course, he hated physical labor and endured it only when the cameras were on him. Like all dictators, like the great Napoleon, Mussolini had visions of great architectural construction. He planned to make his name live forever by pulling down derelict buildings and restoring the glories of imperial Rome. He wanted to be remembered as the successor of the Roman emperors. Here, too, he wielded the pick himself, enough to give the impression that Mussolini had done all this construction. Of course, real things were done in Italy in these years. Fascism gave Italy the first motor roads in Europe. The most lasting achievement of fascism was the draining of the Pontine marshes. The reclaimed land gave work to thousands of agricultural laborers. Other European governments did much the same, and better, without any of the advertisement and boasting. In Italy, it was all done for the greater glory of Mussolini. He was always on the spot at the decisive moment, always there to take the credit. Even the increase of agricultural land was turned into a show. It received a dramatic name, the battle for grain. This was Mussolini's favorite word. Politics were battle, farming was battle, housing was battle. Naturally, war and preparations for war took the first place. In the years after the First World War, when other countries were disarming, Italy under Mussolini was the one country which still talked of war and boasted of her armaments. In appearance, Italy was being turned into a formidable military power. The reality? Very little. The armaments were for show, impressive only on parade. The uniforms were more important than the equipment behind them. Mussolini liked to talk of Italy's 8 million bayonets. Actually, there were fewer, far fewer. In any case, modern wars are not won with bayonets. His navy, he liked to think, was formidable, but his experience was to show it was not equipped to fight in a really modern war. He seemed to be the most powerful statesman in Europe, so long as parades and words were all that counted. Europe trembled as the Italian people was stirred into a frenzy of enthusiasm by Mussolini's balcony performances.
Gli uomini verranno si realizzassero le premesse necessarie e sufficienti per una collaborazione delle 4 grandi potenze occidentali. E noi abbiamo bruciato i nostri bastimenti alle nostre spalle. Deve cristallizzare una posizione di potente ingiustizia. Giornata luminosa di sole e fervida di speranze è questa. Sangue, principi che sorgono e che nascono e i principi che declinano, la vittoria è per noi, per i primi. E può sfidare come sfida tutti i suoi nemici e anche l'andare del tempo. Si aveva dell'Italia una concezione superficiale e pittoresca di quel pittoresco che io detesto. Ne avevate mai dubitato? Lo credete che io mantengo sempre le mie promesse? Noi siamo tesi verso l'avvenire e sentiamo come una creazione della nostra volontà attesa nello spasimo della vittoria. Che ignorava la scrittura con la quale tramandare i documenti della propria vita in un tempo in cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
So stood Mussolini at the height of his power. He was the dictator, the idol of the masses, all powerful. He stood alone on the balcony. But in Germany, Hitler too was using the methods of fascism. He turned them to more fearful ends. The same terrorism, the same parades, but with a more ruthless organization. Hitler admired Mussolini, claimed that he'd learned fascism from him. In Venice, in June 1934, Hitler and Mussolini met for the first time. Hitler cut an unimpressive figure with none of Mussolini's physical glamour. Mussolini patronized him, showed him how to behave like a dictator. Hitler came forward on the balcony modestly, almost timidly. Mussolini still seemed the dominant figure. He was not impressed by Hitler. He said, "I don't like the look of him." Hitler gave no promises of good behavior. He was determined to get his way. In fact, the comedy of fascism was over. Mussolini was no longer alone on the balcony. And in any case, The balcony was no longer enough. Reality was about to break in. Mussolini parted at Venice on outwardly friendly terms. Fascist salutes were exchanged. The switch in roles was to begin. A month after their first meeting at Venice, the Nazis staged an uprising in Austria. They seized the chancellery in Vienna, murdered the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss. Because Austria was the essential barrier between Italy and Germany, Mussolini took fright. He moved Italian troops to the Alpine frontier of the Brenner. Hitler had to pull back and repudiate the Austrian Nazis. He was humiliated, and Austria was saved, for the time being. Mussolini was hailed as the champion of European peace. An unwelcome role for one who prided himself on being the great man of war. Others drove him further along this road. At Stresa, the statesmen of Europe gathered to form a united front against Hitler. Laval and Flandin, Ramsay MacDonald, Sir John Simon. They clustered round Mussolini, hailed him as one of themselves. Respectability threatened to take him prisoner. He was being urged to take a stand against Hitler and realized that he might have to do the fighting for England and France. Arrogantly and desperately, Mussolini sought a way out. He resolved to conquer Abyssinia, to establish there an Italian empire. For the first time, this man of action acted. It was a characteristic move, born out of fear, frustration, and envy of the German strength. Mussolini recognized that his position in Europe was being threatened, and he grabbed at Abyssinia as compensation. He chose the one victim against which even the Italian army, though badly equipped, could be successful. Planes and tanks created terror in this backward country. Italian aeroplanes sprayed poison gas on the Abyssinian forces. War could be once more a matter of show, a self-indulgence, a further boost to Mussolini's vanity. The old master of display had his last triumph. As he played at war, the League of Nations condemned Italy as an aggressor and tried, half-heartedly, to deter Mussolini by imposing sanctions. Haile Selassie himself appeared at Geneva to protest against the invasion of his country. But in vain. Mussolini was not impressed, and the war continued. He deluded the Italian people into believing that poor, gallant Italy was surrounded by a ring of jealous powers. He persuaded the Italians to sacrifice their money, even their wedding rings, to continue to pay for the war. The Abyssinians surrendered. Mussolini had done it. He had given Italy an empire. This was his moment of greatest triumph. Europe defied, Italian arms victorious. There was a feather in Mussolini's cap. For 20 years he had talked. Now he had acted. He thought himself to be the great man of war. A swaggering Mussolini strutted on the balcony. If only history could have stopped at that moment, what a great man Mussolini would have seemed. The triumphant Mussolini visited Hitler in Berlin. Hitler welcomed him as a conquering hero. Mussolini was anxious to show off his versatility. He addressed the crowd in German.
Der die Fragen des Siegaus des Zusammenlebens der Völker ergeben, nicht mit Stillschweigen übergeht, sondern sie löst.
It was unfortunate that no one could understand him. He went on to see the German army maneuvers, and he saw for the first time the discipline and might of the German forces. He was impressed and apprehensive.
Deutschland, sieg heil!
This was for Mussolini the moment of decision. The choice seemed easy. On one side, resisting Germany. On the other, going along with Hitler. At bottom, Mussolini did not trust Hitler, did not admire or like him. He feared Hitler. His fears were soon to be realized. In March 1938, Hitler invaded Austria without a word of warning to Mussolini until the last moment. This time, Mussolini remained silent and acquiesced in Hitler's conquest. Hitler ran over with gratitude. Tell Mussolini I will never forget this. I shall stick to him even if the whole world be against him. This is the one promise which Hitler was to keep. Mussolini did not like to confess that he had surrendered his independence and pretended that he was still free. He signed with the British the Anglo-Italian Pact. It had no meaning. The British made concessions to Mussolini. He dared not cooperate with them against Hitler. Hitler was now thrusting to the center of the stage. He visited Rome, and Mussolini was clearly no longer the dominant figure. His eclipse by the man of real power had begun. Hitler, as head of state, was entertained by Victor Emmanuel. Mussolini had to trail behind, a mere prime minister. His great pride now was to show how he was imitating the Germans. The Italian forces must be taught to do the goose step. They paraded before Hitler and did it badly. Mussolini was angry. The Italians, he declared, are a nation of waiters. But they were going to be forced into greatness, whether they liked it or not. They didn't like it. They didn't like the Germans. But it was of no avail. Mussolini was the dictator. He had chosen the course. He was determined to follow where Hitler led. And the Italian people had to go along with him. Now, Mussolini hesitated to commit himself fully to Hitler's side. He had a last moment of seeming independence. When war threatened over Czechoslovakia, it was Mussolini who proposed the conference at Munich. He produced the supposed compromise on which the conference agreed. Mussolini seemed, but only seemed, to be the great man of Europe. Actually, he had become Hitler's jackal. He was as frightened of war as the Western powers. The British, he thought, once an imperial, had now become a decadent people. Neville Chamberlain still believed pathetically that Mussolini could be used as a moderating influence on Hitler. The more Chamberlain pleaded, the more Mussolini despised him. He made the fateful error of underrating British resolve. He thought he had saved the peace of the world. The British would go on feeding out of his hand, and Hitler, thanks to Mussolini's mediation, would get everything he wanted in Europe without a great war. Hitler took the center of the stage again. On the 15th of March, 1939, he marched into Czechoslovakia. Again, Mussolini was told only at the last minute. He grumbled, "Every time the man occupies a country, he sends me a message." Mussolini reacted by invading Albania, a country which had been for years an Italian dependency. There was no resistance, and for that matter, nothing to be gained. It was the last of Mussolini's empty triumphs. The charade was over, and the stage was set for real events. It was not Mussolini, but Hitler who took the leading role now. On the 1st of September 1939, he attacked Poland. Mussolini stood in the wings. Should he get into the act? Did he have the strength? And if he did, what was in it for him? He reviewed his ill-equipped troops and obsolete weapons and decided that he couldn't be ready for war until 1942. A humiliating confession for a so-called man of action. What could he do? Mussolini went to meet Hitler at the Brenner and explained that he was not ready for war. Hitler didn't really care. He was confident that he could defeat France without Italian assistance. Mussolini was relieved. He could remain non-belligerent and could go on hoping that somehow rewards would fall into his lap without fighting. But he was to be proved wrong. The German armies attacked the Allies in France, and in less than a week, they broke through. As usual, Mussolini had left things too late. Unless he moved fast, he would not take his place at the victor's table. In desperate haste, he made his fatal decision. On the 10th of June, 1940, Mussolini appeared on the balcony. Although he didn't know it, it was to be the last time. He declared war on England and France. He too would be a world conqueror.
Attenti di terra, di mare, dell'aria. Popolo italiano, corri alle armi e dimostra la tua tenacia, il tuo coraggio, il tuo valore.
Mussolini had indeed left things too late. Hitler was already in Paris. A week later, the war in France was over. The French signed the armistice of defeat. German troops occupied much of France. Italy occupied 2 French villages. Mussolini was compelled now to fight a real war. Now came the test for his boasted armaments. They failed to pass the test. The Italian ships proved no match for the British. Italian battleships were sunk at sea, they were sunk in harbor. The Mediterranean never became the Italian lake of Mussolini's dreams. Another dream was to be shattered. For years, he had gloried in visions of conquering Egypt and of a triumphal Napoleonic entry into Alexandria. He waited, poised in the wings, with the sword of Islam in his hand, ready to lead the victory parade. But it was not to be. The dream was broken by the reality of Alamein. The Italian armies collapsed. The Italian soldiers surrendered in droves. They were glad to be finished with the war, with fascism, with Mussolini. He was outwardly unshaken. In fact, he too wished only to be finished with the war. The British and American armies had cleared North Africa. Soon they would be on Italian soil. Mussolini resolved to assert himself. He went to see Hitler in order to insist that the war must be ended at once. He'd set off for Germany in brave spirits. But the moment he met Hitler, his courage crumbled. Hitler's determination was unshakable. He was determined to fight to the last, and he insisted that Mussolini must fight with him. Mussolini too had to pretend that he was confident of final victory. He too had to blow himself up once more into being the great dictator. Hitler's devotion to Mussolini was unchanged. He would never desert his comrade. Mussolini had to agree to go on with the war. He pretended, at least while he was with Hitler, that he was again inspired. He knew that he took with him no promise of German assistance, and that he was finished. Others must get Italy out of the war. He could not. In Rome, he faced the Grand Council. For the first time, they challenged his authority. He was outvoted. The next day, Mussolini reported to the king. After 20 years of feebleness, Victor Emmanuel dismissed him and ordered his arrest. The people who had once supported him now demonstrated against him. The old political leaders emerged from their obscurity. A free political life began again. It was as though fascism had never been. The balcony was empty. Swiftly and silently, Mussolini was spirited away, first to one island, then to another, forgotten, rumored dead. In fact, he was interned on an island along with political prisoners whom he himself had sent there. Forgotten by everyone. By everyone except Hitler. His last move was to a mountain hotel at the top of Gran Sasso, alone and isolated. Mussolini meditated, "I'm a man 3/4 dead." But the drama was not yet over. On the 12th of September 1943, Hitler sent Otto Skorzeny and German commandos to rescue Mussolini. Mussolini appeared, an old, broken man. He'd no desire to be forced back to life. He asked his rescuers to take him to his country home. There he would retire forever. Impossible, they said. Hitler had not rescued Mussolini as a personal kindness. He had rescued him so that Mussolini could be again the great dictator, could again play the great man. He had become, to the full extent, Hitler's prisoner. A mere puppet, he was flown to Munich. There, deeply moved, Hitler was waiting for him, his only friend. Hitler had sworn to stand by Mussolini, and he kept his promise. Although shown every outward honor, still treated as Hitler's equal, it was made clear to Mussolini what he had to do. He had to go back to Italy and to start up the show all over again. Did Mussolini have any hope, any illusions? Even now he was mesmerized by Hitler. He grew more resolute in his presence. He lost heart as soon as Hitler's back was turned. But there was no alternative. A man who has played a part all his life cannot drop it or take up another one. Mussolini muttered, "I must follow my destiny to the end." Back in northern Italy, Mussolini set up a government at Sarlo on Lake Garda. Ministers met, shuffled papers, solemnly deliberated. It was all a sham. The Allies were in southern Italy, the Germans ran northern Italy. There was no Italian army. The Italian authorities had no power. The government of Sarlo discussed things in the void. Mussolini often broke off meetings, stared at the rain and said, "We're all dead." Yet still the old act had to be performed. Mussolini had to meet Hitler for fresh conferences. He had to behave as though he'd something important to contribute to the discussions. Round him at these discussions stood only Germans. The two supermen had become shabby. The two men of power were all powerful no longer. Yet there were still sparks of the old magic. Mussolini still got the cheers of the crowd when he appeared. Perhaps this was genuine enthusiasm. In any case, it made no difference. Mussolini had become nothing, a man of no account. He trailed off once more to visit Hitler in East Prussia. Hitler greeted him 2 hours after a bomb had exploded in Hitler's headquarters. Mussolini listened to Hitler's sad tale, sympathized with him, tried to restore his spirits. This was the end of an extraordinary relationship. Hitler and Mussolini were never to meet again. The brutal friendship was over. Now it was really the end for Mussolini. The Allies were advancing into northern Italy. The German armies facing them collapsed. Partisans arose everywhere on the Allied side. They demanded to take over control in Milan. The Germans decided to leave. Mussolini went there to negotiate with the partisans. Then, on a sudden impulse, he decided to leave with the Germans. He left in a German truck, disguised in a German greatcoat. As the German convoy passed through the mountains, Mussolini was joined by his mistress, Clara Petacci. At a mountain village, the convoy was stopped by partisans. They agreed to let the Germans go through if they would hand over any Italians. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were discovered. The partisans, not quite knowing what to do with them, stuck them in a remote farmhouse. The next day, communist partisans learned who the prisoners were. They went up to the farmhouse, told Mussolini to come with them. Mussolini said, "You've come to rescue me. I'll give you an empire." The partisans took Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci a few yards along the road. There they shot them both. 28th of April, 1945. The dead bodies were taken in a truck down to Milan. Here they were put on public display. Once more the crowds turned out to see Mussolini, this time to demonstrate their hate and to heap on him all the blame for the disasters which had overwhelmed Italy. For the last time, Mussolini occupied the center of the stage.